Hello there everybody, Martin here from Affinity for Commander. Yes, we are back with a brand new video after an extended period of leave for the holidays. So without further ado, let's take a look at those opening hands. I am playing my Kalamax the Stormsire spell copying deck, which was recently been upgraded thanks to the support of our sponsor tcghome.com. I keep an opening hand consisting of Opt, Pongify, Thrill of Possibility, Ralstorm's Conduit, Survivor's Encampment, an Island, and a Forest.
I am playing my Mizzix of the Ismargus control deck, keeping a starting hand of Jeweled Lotus, Witness Protection, Talisman of Creativity, Deflecting Swat, Sulphur Falls, Temple of Epiphany, and an Island.
Phil is playing his Shanid Sleeper's Scourge Legends Matter deck, and keeps a hand containing Hope of Gerapur, Arcane Signet, Iganjo Seat of the Empire, Hammerheim, Mines of Moria, Urborg, the original, not the Tomb of Yawgmoth, and a snow-covered mountain.
And finally, Danny is playing his Rigo Streetwise Mentor Weenies deck. He keeps a starting hand made up of Drannith Magistrate, Raise the Alarm, Growing Rights of Itlimoc, Midnight Guard, Command Tower, Prairie Stream, and Windswept Heath.
I win the die roll and start the game off by playing an island before passing to Phil.
Phil plays the Mines of Moria as a land for turn, and passes.
In his turn, Danny plays Windswept Heath and pays 1 life to sacrifice it. He searches his library for Sparda's headquarters, puts the Triland onto the battlefield tapped, and ends his turn.
I start my turn by playing an island, and cast Jeweled Lotus. I immediately sacrifice the Sparkly plant to add 3 red mana to my mana pool, and tap my island to cast my commander, Mizzix of the Ismargus. Extremely pleased to have my commander out turn 1, I pass to Martin, who responds by casting Pongify.
There is absolutely no way that I am letting you have your commander out so early in the game.
He destroys Mizzix in this way, and I get a 3/3 ape token as compensation. I declare war on Martin for his heinous actions, and Martin proceeds to his turn.
I play a forest and pass. No silly mana rock shenanigans from me.
Phil starts his turn by playing a mountain, and casts Arcane Signet. With nothing more to do, he ends his turn.
Danny plays Sunpetal Grove and casts Drannith Magistrate. Having successfully annoyed everyone else at the table, he passes to Alex.
I begin my turn by playing Sulphur Falls and cast Izzet Signet. Moving to combat, I attack Martin with my ape, dealing him 3 damage, and pass the turn. Martin responds to this by casting Impulse, putting one of the top 4 cards of his library into his hand. He puts the remaining 3 cards on the bottom of his deck, and moves to his turn.
I play a mountain and end my turn without casting anything.
For the 3rd time in a row. In his turn, Phil plays a fancy Marsh Flats, and passes to Danny.
Danny plays Command Tower and casts his commander, Rigo Streetwise Mentor. Phil responds to this by sacrificing his fetch land, paying a life to put Survive Triome into play tapped from his library. Danny puts a shield counter on the Catman when he enters the battlefield, and moves to combat, where he attacks Phil with his Magistrate. Phil responds to this by channeling Iganjo, Seat of the Empire, butchering the attacking wizard much like how I just butchered that card's pronunciation.
And butcher it you did.
With everyone's commanders now once again castable, Danny passes the turn, to which I respond by casting Destructive Revelry. I destroy Alex's signet in this way, dealing him 2 damage, and Alex proceeds to his turn.
I hate you so much right now. I start my turn by playing Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1, and keeping the top card of my library where it is. Next, I move to combat, where I once again hit Martin for 3 with my ape. In my second main phase, I tap out to cast Talisman of Creativity, and end my turn.
In my turn, I play Survivor's Encampment and cast my commander, Kalamax the Stormsire. Finally able to block that primate that keeps hitting me, I pass to Phil.
Phil begins his turn by casting his commander, Shanid Sleeper's Scourge. Next he plays Urborg, but not the one you're thinking of, drawing a card and losing a life thanks to Shanid's ability. Not yet finished, Phil casts Hope of Girapor, drawing another card and losing another life before passing.
Danny plays Port Town, revealing an island from his hand to have the land enter untapped. Next he casts Tetsuko, Umezawa Fugitive, and ends his turn.
I play a mountain and continue my feud with Martin by casting Witness Protection. I change Kalamax into a legitimate business person and move to combat. Here I attack Danny with my ape and he declares no blocks, taking 3 damage. Happy with my turn, I pass to Martin.
I start my turn by playing Mossfire Valley and tap out to cast Seedborn Muse.
Gross.
Moving to combat, I attack Alex with my business person, dealing him 1 damage and pass the turn.
Martin untaps all of his permanents in Phil's untap step, and Phil casts Glowing Dwarf Emissary. He loses a life and draws a card thanks to his commander's ability, and plays Minas Tirith as his land for turn. Phil loses another life, draws another card, and uses his remaining mana to cast Chromatic Lantern. Glowing's ability triggers, creating Phil a treasure token, and Phil moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with Shanid, and me with Hope of Girapor, dealing us 2 and 1 damage respectively. With a pretty decent forward state, Phil ends his turn, to which Danny responds by casting Raise the Alarm. Martin responds to this by casting Thrill of Possibility, discarding a card and drawing 2 new ones. With Danny's spell still in the stack, Martin taps his remaining mana to cast the Beast Within that he just drew, targeting Witness Protection.
Kalamax wants to return to his life of crime.
Really not wanting the dinosaur to return, I cast Deflecting Swat, changing the target of Martin's spell to Tetsuko. The rogue is destroyed and Danny gets a 3/3 beast token to replace them with.
Losing the whole creatures you control are unblockable ability.
Now that drama is finally over, Raise the Alarm resolves, creating Danny 2 1/1 soldier tokens. With the stack now empty and no further interruptions, Danny moves to his turn.
Danny untaps, I untap, and Danny plays Sea of Clouds. Next he casts Growing Rights of Itlamok, taking a look at the top 4 cards of his library. Danny puts the Avacyn's Pilgrim from among them into his hand, puts the rest on the bottom of his library, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Alex and myself with a soldier, and Phil with his beast, drawing 2 cards thanks to Rigo's ability. Not wanting Danny to transform his enchantment, Phil blocks the beast with Glowing, and I block the soldier coming my way with my commander. All 4 creatures are destroyed, Alex takes 1, and Danny moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he casts the Avacyn's Pilgrim from earlier, and passes to Alex.
I draw, have a flick through my graveyard, and pass.
Because that's not suspicious at all. I begin my turn by playing a forest and recast my commander. Moving to combat, I deal Phil 2 damage with my Muse, and with nothing more to do, I end my turn.
Martin taps when Phil does, and Phil plays Hammerheim as his land for turn. He draws, loses a life, and casts a Circle of Loyalty, which costs 1 less thanks to Shanid being a knight.
Synergy!
Phil draws, loses a life, and moves to combat. Here he attacks Danny with both of his creatures, and Danny declares no blocks. He takes 5 damage, and Phil activates Minas Tirith's ability to draw a card, given that he has in fact attacked with 2 creatures. Phil then passes to Danny, to which Martin responds by tapping Kalamax with Survivor's Encampment, producing a blue mana in this way. Next he casts Chemist's Insight, copying the spell and putting a +1/+1 counter on his commander. Martin draws 4 cards, and Danny proceeds to his turn.
I untap alongside Danny, and Danny plays Ghost Quarter as his land for turn. He immediately sacrifices the land, targeting my encampment with the Quarter's ability, and I respond by using Survivor's Encampment to tap Kalamax for a blue mana. Next I jumpstart Chemist's Insight, discarding a card to do so. Kalamax copies the spell, getting a +1/+1 counter as he does so, and I draw 4 more cards.
This is getting more than a little out of hand now.
Survivor's Encampment is then destroyed, and I put an island into play from my library. Not yet finished, Danny casts Midnight Guard, concerning the rest of the table as to whether or not he has an infinite combo up his sleeve. Next he casts Mirror Entity, and moves to his end step, to which Alex responds by casting Big Score. He discards a card, draws 2, and creates 2 treasure tokens, and Danny's Growing Rights of Itlimoc transforms into Itlimoc, Cradle of the Sun. With no more abilities to resolve, Alex moves to his turn.
I untap, Martin untaps, and I cast Rhystic Study. Next I play Rivendell, which enters tapped, given that I do not control a legendary creature.
Such a shame.
With nothing left to do, I pass the turn, to which Martin responds by casting Opt, paying 1 more for my Rhystic Study. He scries 1, keeping the top card of his library where it is, and draws before proceeding to his turn.
I start my turn by moving straight to combat, where I attack Alex with Kalamax and Phil with Seedborn Muse. Neither player blocks, and before damage occurs, I cast Wilt, paying the Rhystic Study tax. I copy the spell, putting a +1/+1 counter on my commander, and target Rhystic Study and the Circle of Loyalty with my spells. Phil's artifact is destroyed, however Alex responds by casting Fierce Guardianship, countering the spell that targeted his enchantment. Damage then occurs with Alex taking 7 and Phil taking 2, and I proceed to my second main phase. Here I play Exotic Orchard and cast Veyran, Voice of Duality before ending my turn.
Martin untaps his board in Phil's untap step, and Phil moves straight to combat. He attacks me with his commander and Martin with his legendary Thopter. I take 2, Martin takes 1, and Phil sacrifices Hope of Girapor to their own ability. He chooses for Martin to be unable to cast non-creature spells until Phil's next turn, and Martin responds to this by casting Brainstorm. He pays 1 extra for Rhystic Study, draws 3 cards, and puts 2 cards from his hand on top of his library. Hope of Girapor's ability then resolves, causing Martin great distress, and Phil moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he plays Barad-dûr, draws a card, and loses a life. Next he'll cast Demonic Tutor, searching his library for a card and putting it into his hand.
If only someone could have responded to this.
Still not finished, Phil casts Ruinous Ultimatum, and with him unable to pay the Rhystic Study tax, I draw a card. The board is then wiped of all non-land permanents that Phil doesn't control, and the mighty Rigo, thanks to his shield counter. Feeling extremely happy with himself, Phil passes to Danny.
Danny begins his turn by playing a tapped Prairie Stream and casts Ashnod's Altar before passing.
In my turn, I dash in Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, and then move to combat. Here I attack Martin with my Monkey, dealing him 2 damage and creating a treasure token. Martin then begrudgingly exiles the Ral Storm Conduit that was on top of his library, and I cast the Planeswalker using my remaining mana.
I put him there with Brainstorm so he'd be safe from hand hate and wheels. How was I to know I'd get Ragavand?
Anyway, I activate Ral's +2 ability, scrying 1 and putting the card on the bottom of my library. I then move to my end step where Ragavan returns to my hand, and I end my turn.
I play an island and tap all of my lands to cast Kalamax for a 3rd time. Unable to do anything else, I pass to Phil.
Phil begins his turn by casting Dahada, Binder of Wills, drawing a card and losing a life as he does so. Next he activates his Planeswalker's -3 ability, revealing the top 4 cards of his library. Phil puts 2 of these into his graveyard and puts Mox Amber and Yawgmoth's Vile Offering into his hand before creating 2 treasures. He then wastes no time in casting the Vile Offering, losing a life and drawing a card as he does so. Phil destroys Ral and returns the Seedborn Muse in Martin's graveyard to the battlefield with his sorcery, and then casts Mox Amber.
Sorry, but can people please stop stealing my cards? It's very rude, you know.
Phil draws another card, loses another life, and plays Core Haven as his land for turn. He draws another card, loses another life, and moves to combat, where he attacks Danny with Shanid. Unable to block the menacing knight, Danny takes 2 and Phil moves to his second main phase. Here he casts Gix, Yawgmoth's Predator, drawing his 5th card of the turn and losing yet another life. Not wishing to hurt himself any further, Phil discards down to 7 and passes the turn.
Phil untaps in Danny's turn, and Danny plays Misty Rainforest, immediately paying 1 life to sacrifice it. He searches his library for Hallowed Fountain, paying 2 more life to have the Shockland enter the battlefield untapped, and then taps out to cast possibly the worst Craterhoof Behemoth play I have ever seen in my entire life.
The decisions of a desperate man.
Both of Danny's creatures get +2/+2 and move into combat. Danny attacks the harder with his Behemoth. Phil responds to this by activating his Core Haven's ability, preventing the Great Huff from dealing any damage, and a rather deflated Danny ends his turn. Not quite finished ruining other people's days though, Phil responds to this by casting Isildur's Fateful Strike. He draws a card, loses a life, and destroys Kalamax in this way, and I exile cards from my hand until I'm left with 4 in what is one of the most flavourful ways possible. Pleased that he was not part of this turn's abuse, Alex proceeds to his turn.
Phil untaps when I do, and I once again start my turn by dashing in Ragavan. Moving to combat, I attack Martin with the Nimble Pilferer, and Martin takes 2 damage in this way. Gix's ability triggers, and I pay 1 life to draw a card in this way. Martin then exiles a land from the top of his library, and I create a treasure token before moving to my second main phase. Here I cast Baral, Chief of Compliance, which Phil responds by paying 7 mana and discarding 5 cards to Gix's ability. He exiles the top 5 cards in Martin's library, and casts a Curious Herd from among them to create a single 3/3 beast thanks to Danny's altar. Not yet finished, Phil casts Martin's Twinning Staff, closely followed by Martin's Natural Connection.
Stop!
He searches his library for a swamp, puts land to play tapped, and Baral finally resolves. With nothing more to do, I return Ragavan to my hand and pass to Martin.
I untap, Phil untaps, and I play an island as my land for turn. Next I cast Wavebreaker Hippocamp and pass the turn. Phil responds to this by activating his Mines of Moria's ability, exiling 3 cards from his graveyard to create 2 treasure tokens. With no further interruptions, Phil moves to his turn.
Phil begins his turn by moving straight to combat, where he attacks Martin with Gix and his beast, me with Shanid, and Danny with Seedborn Muse. Nobody blocks, with Danny and myself taking 2 and Martin taking 6, and Phil pays 4 life to draw 4 cards with Gix's ability.
When the Mardu deck is outdrawing all 3 of the blue decks.
In his post-combat main phase, Phil plays Shinka, the Blood-Soaked Keep, drawing another card and losing another life. Phil then remembers that he has a Dahada in play, and uses her +2 ability to give Gix indestructible until his next turn. He then casts 1 ring to rule them all, making Gix his ring bearer, and milling all 4 of us for 3 cards. Still not finished, Phil casts Shadow Spear, losing a life and drawing a card. He then taps his remaining land to cast the Eternal Wanderer, losing yet another life and drawing yet another card.
This level of self-inflicted life loss is getting dangerous now.
Phil activates his Wanderer's +1 ability, exiling Danny's Crater of Behemoth in this way. And finally finish, ends his turn.
Phil untaps alongside Danny, and Danny plays Fabled Passage as his land for turn. He sacrifices the newly played land, searching his library for a Wastes, which he uses to help cast Akroma's Memorial. Moving to combat, Danny attacks me with his commander, to which Phil responds by negating the damage dealt with Core Haven. Annoyed that he won't be gaining any life, Danny moves to his end step, where Crater of Behemoth returns to the battlefield from exile. Phil responds by creating 2 treasures with the Mines of Moria, and Danny passes to Alex.
I untap, Phil untaps, and I cast a cheeky gamble. In response to this, Martin casts Twin Cast, targeting himself, and draws a card thanks to his Hippocamp. Martin then searches his library for a card and puts it into his hand. He then randomly discards a card, which he reveals was the card he tutored for, and I resolve my gamble, hoping to have better luck. I put a card from my library into my hand and then randomly discard it in the same way Martin did.
Oh dear.
Deeply saddened, I cast Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, and pass the turn. Phil responds to this by creating 2 treasures with his mine, and Martin moves to his turn.
Phil and I untap our boards, and I play Yavimaya Coast as my land for turn. Next I tap all of my lands to recast Kalamax once again, and end my turn. Phil responds to this by activating Gix's ability, exiling the top 4 cards of Alex's library. He casts the Commander Sphere and Steady Progress that were exiled, proliferating the counters on both of his Planeswalkers and Saga before drawing a card. 1 ring to rule them all then triggers, destroying all non-legendary creatures on the battlefield, and Phil moves to his turn.
Phil draws and puts a 3rd lore counter on his Saga before sacrificing it. This causes Danny to lose 7 life, Martin to lose 4, and me to lose 0, given that I have exactly 0 creatures in my graveyard.
Lucky you.
Concerned for his own life total, Phil equips Shadow Spear to Gix and moves to combat. Here he attacks Martin with Gix and Danny with his commander, neither of which can be blocked due to them having Menace. Before damage occurs, Phil returns Shanid to his hand in order to ninjutsu out Nashi, Moon's Sage's Scion, and damage then occurs. Danny takes 3, Martin takes 4, and Phil gains 4 from Gix's lifelink. We all then exile top card of our libraries thanks to Nashi's ability, and Phil moves to his second main phase. Here he pays 5 life in order to cast Tevash Sezat, Doom of Fools that he just exiled, and activates his +2 ability to create 2 0/1 Thrall tokens. Next, Phil used the Eternal Wanderer's 0 ability to create a 2/2 Samurai token with double strike, and reveals top 4 cards of his library with Dehada's -3 ability. He puts Inventor's Fair into his hand, and the other 3 cards into his graveyard, and creates 3 treasure tokens before casting a very pretty Soul Ring. Still not done, Phil recasts Shanid and plays the aforementioned Inventor's Fair as his land for turn. He draws a card, loses a life, and finally finished, passes to Danny.
In his turn, Danny plays a tapped Breeding Pool and moves to combat. Here he attacks Dehada with Rigo, which Phil is unable to block due to Akroma's Memorial granting the Catman flying and protection from black and red. Dehada's loyalty is reduced to 0, sending her to the graveyard, and Danny passes the turn. Alex responds to this by activating Rivendell, scrying 2, and putting both cards on the bottom of his library before proceeding to his turn.
I start my turn by playing Boseiju, who shelters all, and then end my turn without casting anything.
Have you got 7 mana open there?
That's not important.
I begin my turn by playing an island, and then move to combat. Here I attack Phil of Kalamax, which he decides not to block, and before damage I cast Roiling Regrowth. I put a +1/+1 counter on my commander, sacrificing 2 lands, and put 4 lands into play from my library. Damage then occurs with Phil taking 5, and I pass the turn to him. Phil responds to this by sacrificing Inventor's Fair to their own ability, searching his library for Blackblade Reforged.
Oh, that's not good.
He puts a legendary sword into his hand and moves to his turn.
In his turn, Phil casts the Black Blade he just tutored for, to which Martin responds by casting Stubborn Denial.
See Wally, I've learned my lesson from our game at Command Fest.
He puts a +1/+1 counter on Kalamax, copying the counterspell as he does so, and Phil responds by floating a white mana with his Commander Sphere. Then sacrifices the sphere to draw a card, and the pointy sword is put into Phil's graveyard. Shanid's ability then resolves, drawing Phil a card and losing him a life. Not to be deterred, Phil plays Sokuzen, Crucible of Defiance, drawing another card and losing another life. Next, he casts Elish Norn, Grand Cenobite, drawing a card and losing a life as he does so. Rigo and Ragavan's toughness are reduced to 0, sending them to the graveyard, and Phil moves to combat. Here he attacks me with Gix, Martin with Nashi, and the rest of his creatures at Danny. Danny takes lethal damage, I take 6 and Martin takes 5, with Phil gaining 6 life thanks to Gix's lifelink. Everybody other than the now deceased Danny exile top card of our libraries due to Nashi's triggered ability, and Phil moves to his post-combat main phase. Here he pays 3 life to cast the Prismari command that I exiled, dealing 2 damage to Baral and creating himself a treasure token. I respond to this by casting Reiterate, copying the command and dealing 2 damage to Phil in this way. I then create a treasure token and Baral is destroyed when Phil's version of the command finally resolves. Not yet finished, Phil used the Eternal Wanderer's 0 ability to create another double striking samurai and then activates Sezat's +1 ability. He sacrifices a Thrall in this way, drawing 2 cards as he does so, and then casts Board the Weatherlight. Phil looks top 5 cards of his library, putting the Umezawa's Cheetah among them into his hand. Finally finished, Phil discards down to 7 and passes the turn.
Well, that was certainly a turn. Alex starts his turn by playing a mountain and recasts his commander. Mizzix immediately dies due to Elish Norn's ability, and Alex decides to decline the table's offer to take his play back.
A real man lives with the consequences of his own actions.
With things looking rather bleak, Alex ends his turn.
In his turn, Martin moves straight to combat, where he attacks me with Kalamax. I declare no blocks, and Martin responds by casting Deliberate. He puts a +1/+1 counter on his dinosaur, copies the spell, scries 2 and draws a card. Martin then scries 2 and draws once more, and damage then occurs with me taking 5. The load of mana still open, Martin passes to Phil.
I stop Phil in his upkeep in order to cast Ravaging Blaze, where X is 9. I copy the spell, putting another +1/+1 counter on my commander, and target Gix and Elish Null with the burn spell. Staring 2 bouts of lethal damage in the face, Phil responds to this by activating Gix's ability, exiling the top 6 cards of Alex's library in a desperate attempt to find something that will save him. Luckily for Phil, Alex exiles Flusterstorm, which Phil casts countering both of my spells in this way.
What are the chances?
Pretty low, I'd assume. With nothing left to oppose him, Phil then moves to combat where he deals lethal damage to both Alex and I, winning himself the game. Well, that is it for another video. I do hope that you enjoyed watching Phil save himself with Alex's counterspell. I'd like to give a huge thank you to each and every one of our amazing patrons for supporting us via patreon.com. We wouldn't be able to continue making content such as this without your help, so thank you. Also, be sure to check out our affiliate links in the video description. It doesn't cost you anything extra to make your purchases through these, but it really helps out the channel. And do be sure to check out our latest sponsor, tcghome.com, where you can sort your deck lists and your collection out in one convenient space. And finally, don't forget that you can help to support us in 4 quick and easy ways: liking this video, subscribing, hitting that bell icon, and leaving us a comment. I read every one. That's it for now though, we'll see you next time. Stay awesome!